Hello, I'm Giselle Gamby, host of the Intuitive Pull podcast and business and life coach. My coaching business has consistently brought in $500,000 in revenue for the past 10 years, not from any external strategy, but from being the intuitive entrepreneur. Having worked strategy first, as most people do, with little results, I know that authenticity is profitable, and the deeper you go, the greater your wealth always. And so this podcast is here for you if you desire more, deserve more, and are called into more in relation to your wellness and purpose, business and career, finances, relationships, and health. If you're stuck, feel like you've lost your mojo, and equally if you're doing really well, but you know that you and your life could be so much bigger, so much more purposeful, and so much more impactful. Join myself and my guests as we explore 2024's theme, Untapped Abundance. I love creating ripples, and so here's to creating even more ripples this year for this wonderful Intuitive Pull community. Hello, dear Intuitive Pull listeners. I have 3 episodes that all come under the theme of leadership that I am about to publish on the Intuitive Pull podcast. They are a reflection of what I've been receiving in the last 2 weeks. Seriously, the last 2 weeks, I have felt so connected. And I feel like what I've been receiving in the last 2 weeks has not been 2 weeks worth. It's been, 2 years worth. And they're really powerful, very, very powerful. And so the first episode, I'm just going to kind of allow you to see the flow. The first episode, this one right now, is around the theme of that it's vulnerable to be in our leadership. It's vulnerable to be in our strengths and gifts. It is. It's vulnerable at times. That's the first episode. The second episode following on from that is when we don't take the risk of being vulnerable in our leadership, what happens? And I have a really awesome story to tell you. And then the third episode was an interesting one. I was walking on Thursday, which is only yesterday, or Wednesday, I think it was, on Wednesday. And I had this sense come over me, and I knew that I could hardly even touch it. It was just this feather of a feeling. And I knew that I had to come home. I knew I had to close my eyes. I knew I had to feel this feeling and let the feeling speak out the words. And so it's a little fiery, that one. And I know it's not for everybody, but for the people that it is for, oh boy, watch out. I think on one hand, you'll be thankful for that. And and it's also, how do I say it? It's also a real kick up the bum, a loving kick up the bum. So I hope the next 3 episodes are just as powerful for you as the information that I've been receiving in the last 2 weeks has been for me. So let's go to the first episode. It's vulnerable to be in our strength and power. It's vulnerable to be in our leadership at times. And that's the truth. It is vulnerable to be in our strength and power. These are words that have been playing with me and playing with me and playing with me. And they played with me last week. And particularly when leadership feels like it comes from beyond, like it's not leadership born from Giselle. It's not leadership born from Giselle. It's not leadership born from you. It's leadership that comes through us. Like when we're being directed or guided, it's leadership that comes through us. There's not only a vulnerability to stand in that form of leadership, but there's also a humility, because it is coming through us and we are the vehicles for that directive or that information or that calling. And when that happens, it can feel vulnerable to lead from here. it really can feel vulnerable when we lead from our intuition and knowing, because it's vulnerable to feel and be different. Just if this is speaking to you, it is vulnerable to be different. And I would imagine that listeners of the Intuitive Pool podcast, there is a sense of this is not the way all of the world lives and leads from. And so there is a vulnerability to lead from intuition and knowing. And there's such a humility, like I almost feel like crying, because it's such a great blessing. I was on Zoom with somebody this morning and we had the most, oh my goodness, the most magnificent conversation. And the conversation was around this transition that she is going from and into. And it was such a peaceful, joyful, quietly joyful, and palpable energy that we were imbibing in. And I said to her, aren't we blessed that we have the presence, that we can feel this energy? Aren't we blessed? So yes, when we lead from our intuition and knowing, when we lead from presence, it is different from how the mass operates from. It's much noisier. It's much more strategic. It's much more orientated in the doing world. And there's such a beautiful humility in that. And speaking of, when we step aside from how things are done, regular ways of doing, convention, culture, and we live and lead and speak from our presence and our intuition and our knowing, when we speak to paradigms that are not yet common, it is a vulnerable place to be at times. And it is a vulnerable place to be when we have the intuition and the knowing to call people forward and to step into a vision that you, as the custodian of that vision, can see. But most people can't yet see, and some people do not even want to see it. But the ones who can't yet see it are needing you to step into that vision so that they can then share in that version of reality with you. It's a vulnerable place to be. It's a vulnerable place to be when we take risks, right? When we put ourselves out there publicly and we lead from what we know. I have several people right now in the Sacred Leaders group who are doing that, just that. I mean, they are innovating. They are bringing new ways into executive coaching, into consultancy, into schools. It's a vulnerable thing to take those risks and to put ourselves out there publicly and to lead from what we know. It's vulnerable to follow those pools. These people, they're following the intuitive pools because sometimes when they first arrive, they're just formless. And I remember many times when I have had an intuitive hit and I can't even yet describe it. And in the inability to even yet describe it, and even when the moment comes that we can describe it, there are no guarantees. There are no guarantees, but in our heart of hearts, when that intuition is so strong, we know that we actually have no choice but to follow the intuitive pull. And that's a vulnerable place to be. It's vulnerable to communicate what you'd prefer not to, at the risk of someone not liking what you say or pulling away. I had an experience about that I'll speak to in my next episode, that it was a little vulnerable for me to share something that I was feeling with somebody. But I won't spoil the second episode by giving any more than that. You'd need to go to the second episode for that. It is so vulnerable to let go of control. My goodness, the world operates from control. Business operates from control. Business operates from the masculine. And it is really vulnerable, especially if that's been your modus operandi. to let go of control and surrender into grace. Because the ego thinks that if I let go of control, then I will meet chaos. Then things will fall apart. Then I will fall apart. And again, this was another conversation I was having this week. I was actually saying, the place to go now for this person, I said, is you need to allow yourself to fall apart for a moment. And I said that won't mean that you won't be able to operate in your business. It won't mean that you'll be irresponsible with your children. It won't mean that you'll end up in hospital. It will just mean that you'll allow yourself to feel that vulnerability that you haven't allowed yourself to feel. That you'll be able to put down that mask or that tool that they've operated from control for a moment, and really trust yourself. Trust yourself to be with whatever is here to be with and feel. So yeah, it's really vulnerable to let go of control and allow grace to do the heavy lifting. It's also vulnerable to play the what if this worked game. What if this worked? Who would I become? Who would I no longer be? What would people think of me? Where my responsibilities lie then? And it's really vulnerable to choose what you really, really desire. What you really, really desire beyond responsibilities, beyond roles that you've played, especially when those roles have worked for you, have given you a good life. It's really vulnerable to choose what you really, really desire when you're surrounded by your own expectations and other expectations of you, when you're surrounded by others' opinions of what they think you can and can't do, when it comes at a risk of no longer being the person that people have known you to be. It's super vulnerable to choose what you really, really, really desire. And, it's really vulnerable to decide that you are fiercely fucking deserving and to make that commitment to living your most miraculous and abundant timeline. It's so vulnerable to decide that you are fiercely fucking deserving of that. And that you are making that commitment to living your most miraculous, abundant timeline. It's so vulnerable. And as I was receiving those words and really feeling all of those words last week, where I flowed to was, what do I desire? Well, what I most desire is that people inhabit a deep relationship with themselves and that they live from the riches of presence, of personal responsibility that has given us, myself and all the people I've worked with, so much. That they live from the riches of intuition. Yes, from the riches of intuition. From the riches of knowing, trusting self. From the riches of surrendering. From the riches of faith and grace. From the riches of the plans they didn't make. From the riches of following the yellow brick road to their heart's greatest joy and fulfillment. This is what I desire. This is my sacred leadership. My sacred leadership is to facilitate that. And in my sacred leadership, I desire to be even more of a demonstration of this through this podcast, through the book that I'm writing, through my coaching, through the life that I live. I desire to be more of a demonstration of this so that calls people forward, so that they experience that they too can see what happens when we live from the riches of our infinite and eternal self. So they too can see what happens when they live from the riches of being connected to all beyond time and space. And these beautiful words that arrived when I was with this energy, so that they too can see what happens when we live in the tapestry of the divine mind. In the tapestry of the divine mind. That is my sacred leadership. Because I know through my experience that in the tapestry of the divine mind, that knows what and who and when and how and why, that when we live in the tapestry of the divine mind, it offers such an abundance of all that matters the most to us. And it offers the opportunity to know what sits deep within our hearts and to live from here. You know, this is what matters the most to me. And it's this let go into here, into living and leading from here that calls me every single day. It's why I give myself so much time in the morning to be with this. Everything that I write about, everything that I speak about here on the podcast comes from this place, comes from the riches of this inner relationship with myself and with the tapestry of the divine mind. What I desire the most is that people experience the riches of stepping outside of control, of planning, of needing to know. And you know what? Sometimes I go there myself. Sometimes I can lose myself in there when something new comes and I want to know how, and I try to plan it out, and then I catch myself. That's not how it rolls. It always rolls from following the intuitive pull. And when we follow the intuitive pull, we step into grace. We step into a relationship with life that is one of surrender, that leads us into living visions and realities that we could never have anticipated at the start line. Never, never, never. So this is what I most desire, because when we live from here, we experience a generosity that sits beyond our own personal expectations, beyond other people's expectations. And we experience the privilege of witnessing ripples upon ripples upon ripples of impact, because we have chosen to live from love. And I know this for sure, and it's something that I say all the time in coaching, that as we go first, so too do others. And I seem to attract those people in coaching. I seem to attract the ones, whether they want to originally or at the beginning, maybe not. But then they surrender. They're the ones that are here to go first so that others can follow. So yes, I think you get the gist. It is truly vulnerable to be in our strength and power. It is truly vulnerable to live from our own sacred leadership, whatever that might be. And again, there's such a beautiful humility within it, because our leadership does not come from our person, it comes from beyond. And that's the truth. And this is the only place I want to play. Again, I'll put my hand up and say, sometimes I forget, especially when something new arrives. I will sometimes go into my head and sometimes go into planning and sometimes trying to work it all out until I catch myself and decide to play here. And when the premise that, you know, these words had never come to me before around it being vulnerable to be in our strength and power, you know, I was really feeling the pull to lean here. Not in the absence of the strength and power of vulnerability, because there's strength and power being in our vulnerability. But here we're being asked to be in the vulnerability of our strength and power. It's switched around. It's easy for me to be in my vulnerability and to lead from my vulnerability. I'm an open book, if you haven't figured that out already. Yes, sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes I'd prefer not to share what I share. but I know that I have no choice but to. But here we're flipping it around. We're saying, lean into the vulnerability of our strength and power. Lean into the vulnerability of our leadership. And I want to play with people who are ready to lean here. I want to play with people who feel what I'm writing about, what I'm speaking about, what I'm sharing about. I want to play with people who feel the humility of what I'm talking about. For all the riches that I spoke to on this episode. Thank you for listening to this episode. So I'm now going to record the second flow-on episode from this theme of being in the vulnerability of our strength and power. Ciao for now, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share it with your loved ones. And I look forward to you listening to the next episode. Ciao. Hey guys, if you love this podcast, I have 2 requests. Number 1, sign up to the newsletter, which you can find in the show notes. Sharing is one of my superpowers, and there is only so much that I can share through the medium of podcasting. And I have very big plans this year to be radically generous to you. So sign up to that newsletter where you'll be able to receive a whole lot more that I trust will be super valuable to you. And number 2, I'm a massive referrer of the people I love to the people I love. Please share this episode or podcast with the people you love, and let's create some more breathtaking ripples of impact.